wasn't planning on breaking my big toe. It's all nasty, man. Yeah, I was supposed to go to Jamaica after this. No, I don't think that's going to happen.
He is widely considered the greatest fighter who ever lived. 28 wins, 2 division championships, a 17-year run through the UFC that no before him, and arguably no fighter after him, will ever match. He beat Daniel Cormier. He beat Alexander Gustafsson. He beat Rashad Evans. He beat every single man the light heavyweight division had to offer, and then he moved up to heavyweight and won that title too. On paper, Jon Jones is the greatest combat sports athlete in UFC history. And yet, in February 2026, a video surfaced, quietly recorded backstage at a combat sports event, of Jon Jones whispering to a fellow fighter, speaking in an almost hushed tone about something he said most people don't know. He wasn't talking about a future fight. He wasn't negotiating a contract. He wasn't calling anyone out. He was talking about his hip, covered in arthritis, already qualifying for a full replacement, going to bed in so much pain during his last training camp that he could barely sleep. And just weeks before that video surfaced, in one of the most honest and haunting interviews of his career, Jon Jones sat down and said something that sent a chill through everyone who heard it. He said he was scared of brain damage. Not the kind of scared that fighters say to generate headlines. The kind of scared that comes from a man who met a retired fighter, a once great competitor who could no longer remember his own birthday. That is the story we're telling today. Not the highlight reel, not the championships, not the controversies, though we will get to those because they are part of the truth, the sad truth about Jon Jones at 38 years old. Welcome back. Let's go. The brain fear. Let's start with the words that cut right to the heart of this story. In early 2026, Jon Jones was asked about the risks of continued fighting, and what he said wasn't bravado. It wasn't a press conference line, it was fear. Real, unfiltered, honest fear from a man who has taken thousands of strikes across nearly 2 decades of elite competition, he said. I don't want to be one of these fighters that win some and lose some and can't remember what your name is. I met a fighter a few years ago. He didn't know when his birthday was. That's a lot of fighting. I'm far from that, and I don't even want to know what that looks like. Think about what it takes for a man like Jon Jones, one of the most competitive, most fearless, most relentlessly driven human beings to ever step inside a UFC octagon, to sit down and say something like that. He is not telling you he has brain damage. He is telling you he is terrified of getting it. He is telling you that the thought of becoming that retired fighter, the one who couldn't remember his own birthday, haunts him. And that fear is not irrational, it is science. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, is a progressive degenerative brain disease found in people with a history of repetitive head trauma. The symptoms include memory loss, confusion, impaired judgment, paranoia, problems with impulse control, aggression, and depression. It cannot be diagnosed in a living person. You only find it in autopsy. And Jon Jones has been absorbing strikes at the highest level of the sport since he was 20 years old. Even Joe Rogan, one of the most prominent voices in MMA, a man who has sat ringside for hundreds of UFC events, raised the question publicly over a decade ago about whether some of Jones' most erratic behaviors over the years could be explained by early signs of neurological damage. Not to excuse what Jones did, but to ask a harder question about what years of accumulated trauma does to even the greatest minds in the sport. Dr. David Abbasi, a medical professional who has spoken publicly about Jones, warned that when a fighter acknowledges head trauma publicly, they walk into dangerous territory. Promotions, athletic commissions, and medical licensing boards become extremely cautious. The liability alone could disqualify a fighter from competing, regardless of how physically capable they still are. Jon Jones, at 38, knows this, and he said it anyway, because the truth, the one he can no longer keep quiet, is more important than the next contract. And the brain isn't the only thing breaking down. In a video captured backstage at a dirty boxing event in early 2026, recorded covertly on Meta, smart glasses by a fan, Jon Jones was caught in what appeared to be a private conversation with UFC welterweight Joaquin Buckley. Speaking almost in a whisper, Jones revealed something that his public persona had never let on. He said, "I have severe arthritis, and most people don't know that. My left hip is covered in arthritis. I actually already qualify for a hip replacement. My last training camp, I went to bed in so much pain." And then the sentence that said everything. "I have a 3-year-old baby boy, and I want to use what I've got left in my hips to play with him. This is the man who once looked physically invincible, who stood 6'4", with an 84.5-inch reach, and dismantled some of the most physically gifted athletes on the planet as if it were easy. That man, at 38 years old, is not sure he can get down on the floor and play with his toddler without pain. He revealed he had been receiving stem cell treatment in an attempt to manage the arthritis. He said he was willing to risk his long-term health for one more fight, but only if the UFC made it worth it financially. They didn't. And that brings us to the chapter that reveals perhaps the saddest truth of all. In June 2025, Jon Jones retired from the UFC. Officially, Dana White made the announcement. Tom Aspinall was elevated to undisputed heavyweight champion. But then, President Donald Trump announced a White House UFC event for June 14, 2026. UFC Freedom 250, a celebration of 250 years of American independence, held on the South Lawn of the White House. And Jon Jones, the most decorated American fighter in UFC history, heard that announcement and came out of retirement. He said publicly that representing the United States at that event was worth risking his damaged hip for. He began stem cell treatment. He scheduled a training camp. He said he was ready. And then Dana White announced the Freedom 250 card. Jon Jones was not on it. White, bluntly, told reporters that Jones had never even been considered for the event. The greatest fighter in UFC history. A man who fought 17 years for the company, who sold out Madison Square Garden, who won 2 divisions, who brought the UFC more mainstream attention than almost any other athlete in its history. Not considered. Jones fired back publicly, and for once, his frustration felt entirely earned. He pointed out that he had been preparing, that he had received medical treatment specifically to be ready, that only a fight at the White House, the one event that felt worthy of the physical sacrifice, was worth gambling his health for. So let me get this straight, Jones said. If I had accepted the lowball offer, suddenly my hip would be fine, and I'd be on the White House card. That doesn't make sense. He then did something that signaled true finality of his UFC career. He requested a release from his UFC contract. In April 2026, Jon Jones announced his retirement for what appears to be the last time. Not with a triumphant press conference, not with a ceremony, but with the quiet, bitter acknowledgement that the relationship between the greatest fighter alive and the company he built his legend with had simply run out of road. He has since pivoted to the international combat sports scene, co-hosting events for IB Bare Knuckle in Russia and pursuing an ambassador role in alternative combat sports promotions. A man who once headlined Madison Square Garden is now building a second act on the fringes of the sport he conquered. That is not a triumphant ending. That is a man searching for relevance after the door he built himself was closed in his face. To tell the full truth about Jon Jones at 38, you cannot skip the chapter that his fans most want to avoid, because running parallel to every championship, every title defense, every moment of undeniable athletic greatness, there has been another Jon Jones, a man at war with himself, a man whose personal choices have cost him titles, cost him his reputation, and cost him years of his career. The 2015 hit and run. Jones crashed his car into a pregnant woman's vehicle in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He fled the scene on foot. A pregnant woman was injured. Jones was stripped of his UFC title. It was one of the most shocking incidents in UFC history. The 2020 DUI arrest. Police responded to reports of gunfire and discovered Jones, intoxicated and armed, offering homeless people alcohol from solo cups outside a strip club. The 2021 domestic violence arrest. Following his UFC Hall of Fame induction ceremony, one of the most celebratory nights of his career, Jones was arrested for allegedly assaulting the mother of his children while heavily intoxicated. The 2024 drug testing confrontation. Jones was accused of threatening a USADA testing official who arrived at his home unannounced to collect samples. The 2025 criminal complaint. A woman alleged that Jones, who she claimed was intoxicated, left her at the scene of a car accident. Jones denied the charge, and his legal team challenged the evidence. The charge was still unresolved when Jones retired. These are not rumors. These are documented incidents spanning a decade. And the question that combat sports has never been fully willing to answer is this: what is the relationship between years of neurological trauma at the highest level of the sport and the impulse control issues, the erratic behavior, the pattern of decisions that cost a great man so much? Joe Rogan asked that question over a decade ago, Dr. Abazi raised it more recently. None of it excuses what happened. The people who were hurt, the pregnant woman, the mother of his children, the people around him, deserved better. But the question is legitimate. And it is one that the sport as a whole is going to have to face more honestly, as the generation of fighters who built the UFC moves into their late 30s and 40s. Jon Jones is not the last fighter this question will be asked about. He may just be the most famous one. There is one more layer to the sad truth of Jon Jones at 38, one that doesn't get nearly enough attention. Away from the courtrooms and the Octagon and the contract disputes, Jon Jones is a father of 5 children. He has spoken openly about how much fatherhood means to him, and the image that stays with you from that quietly recorded video backstage at a combat event is not the championships or the controversies or the retirement drama. It is a 38-year-old man whispering that he wants to save whatever is left in his hip joints so he can get on the floor and play with his 3-year-old son. Jon Jones grew up in Endicott, New York, in a deeply religious household. His father, Arthur Sr., was a pastor. His older brother, Arthur Jr., played in the NFL. His younger brother, Chandler Jones, one of the most decorated pass rushers in NFL history. 3 brothers, 3 professional athletes, one family shaped by faith, competition, and a drive to be the best. And Jon, the middle child who became the most famous of them all, has spent his career oscillating between the greatness that background gave him and the battles that fame, money, and accumulated trauma brought with it. He has spoken about alcohol, saying at one point that he had too much trauma to consume alcohol and that he would leave it behind forever. Whether that promise held is unknown, but the acknowledgement of it, the public confession that something inside him needed healing, speaks to a man who knows himself well enough to be afraid of himself. Jon Jones was stripped of his UFC titles 3 times, for drug test failures and arrests. No other champion in UFC history can say that. And yet, every single time he came back, he reclaimed the belt. He proved the doubters wrong. He found another gear when every rational observer assumed the gear was gone. That is not the pattern of a broken man. That is the pattern of a man fighting something relentlessly, inside himself, outside himself, in the octagon and out of it, who refuses to fully surrender. But at 38, with a hip that qualifies for replacement, with the fear of brain damage quietly spoken into the ear of someone who happened to be recording, the fight that Jon Jones may finally be losing is not against a heavyweight contender, is against time, and against the accumulated weight of everything he has put his body and his mind through since he was 20 years old. Jon Jones, at 38 years old, is one of the most complicated, most extraordinary, most heartbreaking figures in the history of sport, the greatest fighter who ever lived. A man whose athletic gifts were so rare that they may never be seen again in the same package. And a man whose personal demons, whose accumulated physical damage, whose relationship with his own greatness, cast a shadow over every single achievement. The sad truth is not that he failed. The sad truth is that he succeeded beyond imagination and paid a price that is only now becoming fully visible. A hip that is essentially already retired, even if he isn't. A brain he is afraid to push any further. A sport that built him into a legend and then couldn't find room for him on its most prestigious card. And 5 children, including a 3-year-old boy, watching their father navigate the end of the most decorated career in UFC history. He said he met a retired fighter who couldn't remember his own birthday. He said he never wanted to become that. And the saddest truth of all, the one nobody wants to say out loud, is that the only way to guarantee he doesn't become that is to never fight. Again, for a man like Jon Jones, that might be the hardest fight of his life. That is the real story of Jon Jones at 38. And now you know it. What do you think? Is Jon Jones truly done? And how do you think history will ultimately remember him? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Like this video if it moved you. Subscribe for more stories like this every week. See you in the next one.